The blood-red sun hung low over the dusty horizon as Kieran Gray staggered back to his homestead, his shirt still caked with the mud from where he'd buried his younger brother not 3 hours prior. The pain in his chest felt more devastating than any bullet wound could ever be, a hollow, gnawing emptiness that threatened to consume him whole as the reality settled in. Jamie was gone, fallen from the cliff's edge while they'd been rounding up strays along the canyon rim. It was 1883 in the unforgiving territory of Arizona, and death was no stranger to these lands. But when it came for your kin, it cut deeper than the harshest winter wind. Kieran's hands trembled as he tied his horse to the post outside his modest cabin, the same hands that had desperately tried to grab Jamie's outstretched arm before he plummeted to the rocks below. "Damn you!" he whispered, not to his brother but to God or fate, or whatever cruel force had taken Jamie from him. At 28, Kieran was now completely alone in the world. Their parents had succumbed to fever 5 years earlier, leaving the brothers to fend for themselves on their small cattle ranch. They had been making it work, even beginning to prosper. Now it was just him. Inside the cabin, he went straight for the bottle of whiskey he kept for special occasions. This wasn't special, but it was necessary. The amber liquid burned his throat as he took a long pull directly from the bottle. He didn't bother with a glass, there was no point in pretending at civility now. A soft knock at the door startled him. Few people ventured out this far, especially as dusk was settling. Kieran considered ignoring it, but whoever it was knocked again, more insistent this time. "Go away," he called out, his voice rougher than he intended. "It's Zara," came the reply, soft but determined. "Zara Lawson," Kieran cursed under his breath. Zara Lawson was the local schoolteacher who had arrived in their small town of Copper Creek about a year ago. He'd exchanged pleasantries with her in town, tipped his hat when they passed on the street, but never anything more. She was educated, refined, everything he was not. "This ain't a good time, Miss Lawson," he called back, taking another swig from his bottle. "I know about Jamie," she said through the door. "Sheriff Miller told me. I brought some food. You should eat something." The mention of food reminded Kieran that he hadn't eaten since breakfast, before everything had gone to hell. With a heavy sigh, he crossed to the door and pulled it open, revealing Zara standing on his porch holding a covered basket. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical bun, a few loose tendrils framing her face. Her blue dress was simple but neat, dusty at the hem from the ride out to his place. "You shouldn't have come all this way," he said, his voice flat. "I thought you might need some company," she replied, her hazel eyes taking in his disheveled appearance, the whiskey bottle clutched in his hand. "I've got company right here." Kieran lifted the bottle slightly. Zara didn't flinch at his rudeness. "May I come in anyway?" Something in her steady gaze made him step aside. She entered, taking in the sparse but tidy cabin with a single glance. 2 chairs sat by the hearth, a small table between them. A larger table with 4 chairs stood near the kitchen area. Jamie's jacket still hung by the door where he'd left it that morning. Zara set her basket on the table and began unpacking, a loaf of bread, some cold chicken, and a jar of preserves. "You need to eat," she said simply. "I need to drink," Kieran countered, but he found himself sinking into one of the chairs at the table anyway. "You can do both." She cut a thick slice of bread, spread it with preserves, and placed it in front of him. "But food first." To his surprise, Kieran found himself taking a bite. The sweetness of the preserves seemed wrong in the face of his grief, but his body responded to the nourishment even if his heart couldn't appreciate it. "Why are you here, Miss Lawson?" he asked after swallowing. "We're hardly friends." "Because no one should be alone on a day like this," she answered, sitting across from him. "I lost my younger sister 3 years ago. Influenza. I know what it is to lose someone you love." Kieran studied her face, searching for pity but finding only understanding. It both comforted and unnerved him. "I'm sorry about your sister," he said awkwardly. "As I am about Jamie." She poured herself a small glass of water from the pitcher on the table. "He was a good young man." The children at school adored him when he came to help with the Christmas pageant. The memory hit Kieran like a physical blow. Jamie with his easy smile, showing the children how to whittle simple wooden ornaments for the tree. He'd had a way with youngsters that Kieran had always envied. He was the best of us, Kieran said, his voice breaking slightly. Always saw the good in people, even when they didn't deserve it. That's a rare gift, Zara said softly. They sat in silence as Kieran continued to eat mechanically, washing down each bite with whiskey. The shadows lengthened across the floor as the sun set outside. Zara lit the lamps without asking, moving around his kitchen as if she belonged there. You don't have to stay, Kieran said when he'd finished eating. I appreciate the food, but you'd rather drink yourself into oblivion alone? She finished for him, her directness catching him off guard. Something like that. Zara surprised him by reaching for his whiskey bottle. She poured a small amount into a glass and took a sip, grimacing slightly at the burn. Then I'll sit with you while you do, she said. Because tomorrow will come whether you want it to or not, and facing it with a clear head would be better. Why do you care? Kieran asked, genuinely confused. You barely know me. I know enough, she said. I know you worked yourself to the bone to keep this ranch going after your parents died. I know you made sure Jamie finished his schooling even though you had to quit. I know you're respected in town for your honesty and fair dealing. Kieran looked away, uncomfortable with her assessment. You've been asking about me. A slight blush colored her cheeks. I observe. It's what teachers do. He reached for the bottle again, pouring more into his glass. The whiskey was starting to dull the edges of his pain, making everything softer, less immediate. Tell me how it happened, Zara said quietly. Sometimes speaking the words helps to make it real, to begin accepting it. Kieran stared into his glass, watching the lamplight reflect off the amber liquid. We were rounding up strays along the canyon edge. One of the calves got spooked, started to slip down the slope. Jamie. His voice faltered. Jamie went after it without thinking. The edge gave way beneath him. I tried to reach him, but it wasn't your fault, Zara said, reaching across the table to touch his hand. I know that, Kieran said sharply, then immediately regretted his tone. In my head I know that. But it doesn't change anything. He's still gone. Yes, he is, Zara agreed, not offering false comfort. And it will hurt for a very long time. Her honesty was refreshing in a way the whiskey wasn't. Kieran found himself studying her more closely, the tiny lines at the corners of her eyes that crinkled when she smiled, the determined set of her chin, the way she held herself with quiet dignity. Did you ride out here alone? He asked suddenly, realizing how dangerous that could be for a woman. Sheriff Miller escorted me part way. I insisted I could make the last mile on my own. He wasn't happy about it, but he had other matters to attend to. It's not safe for a woman to ride these trails alone, especially this close to dusk. Perhaps not, she acknowledged. But I deemed the risk worth taking. Why? Kieran asked again, needing to understand. Zara considered her words carefully before answering. Because I remember the darkness that followed my sister's death. How it consumed me. How I might have been lost to it if not for the kindness of others. She took another small sip of whiskey. Sometimes the greatest act of courage is allowing someone to help you through your grief. They fell into silence again, more comfortable this time. Kieran continued to drink, but slower now, savoring rather than gulping. Zara occasionally joined him with small sips of her own, though she clearly wasn't accustomed to hard liquor. As the night deepened, Kieran found himself telling stories about Jamie, how at 10 years old, he tried to tame a wild Mustang and ended up with a broken arm, how he could mimic any bird call so perfectly that he could call them right to his hand, how his laughter could fill a room and make everyone around him smile. Zara listened, sometimes asking questions, sometimes sharing brief stories of her own sister. The pain didn't lessen, but somehow sharing it made it more bearable. The whiskey bottle slowly emptied as the hours passed. I should go, Zara said eventually, glancing out the window at the dark night. It's late. You can't ride back to town in the dark. Kieran objected, more forcefully than he intended. It's not safe. I hadn't planned to stay this long, she admitted. I thought I would just deliver the food and offer my condolences. Take my bed, Kieran offered. I'll sleep out here. Zara hesitated, clearly considering the impropriety of staying the night in a bachelor's cabin. People will talk. People always talk, Kieran said dismissively. Better that than you getting thrown from your horse in the dark, or worse. After a moment's consideration, Zara nodded. Thank you. But I'll take the chair. You need your rest more than I do. I'm not letting a lady sleep in a chair while I take the bed, Kieran insisted, some of his ingrained manners resurfacing through the haze of grief and whiskey. Then we appear to be at an impasse, Zara said with a small smile. In the end, Kieran fashioned a makeshift bed on the floor near the hearth for himself, while Zara reluctantly took his room. He lay awake for a long time, staring at the dying embers in the fireplace, the whiskey no longer enough to numb the pain of his loss or his awareness of the woman sleeping just a few feet away. When he finally drifted off, his dreams were a confused jumble of Jamie falling, reaching for him, and Zara's steady gaze offering an anchor in the storm of his grief. He awoke to the smell of coffee and the sound of quiet movement in the kitchen. For a moment, still half asleep, he thought it was Jamie, and the events of the previous day rushed back with brutal clarity. Kieran sat up with a groan, his head pounding from too much whiskey. Zara stood by the stove, her hair loose around her shoulders, looking softer and younger in the early morning light. She'd made coffee and was frying bacon in his cast-iron pan. "Good morning," she said softly, noticing he was awake. "There's coffee if you want it." "Thank you," Kieran managed, his voice rough with sleep and lingering emotion. He stood, suddenly self-conscious of his rumpled clothing and unshaven face. Outside, the sky was just beginning to lighten, the darkness giving way to a pale lavender that promised sunrise would soon follow. The empty whiskey bottle sat on the table as testament to the night's vigil. "You didn't have to cook," Kieran said, pouring himself a cup of coffee. "I wanted to," Zara replied. "It's the least I could do before I head back to town." They ate breakfast in companionable silence, the events of the previous evening creating a strange intimacy between them. When they finished, Zara gathered her things while Kieran saddled her horse. "Thank you," he said awkwardly as he helped her mount. "For the food and everything else." Zara looked down at him from her saddle, her expression serious. "Grief isn't something you can outrun, Kieran. Don't try to bury it with the bottle." "I won't," he promised, surprising himself with how much he meant it. "Will I see you in town sometime?" "I teach every weekday at the schoolhouse," she said with a small smile. "And I take my meals at Mrs. Wilkins' boarding house. I'm not hard to find." With that, she turned her horse and rode toward town, leaving Kieran standing in his yard watching her go, feeling like something important had just happened, though he couldn't quite define what. The days that followed were hard. Kieran threw himself into the work of the ranch, exhausting himself physically to keep the worst of the grief at bay. The neighboring ranchers sent hands to help him with the heaviest tasks, understanding that losing his only family changed everything. He accepted their help grudgingly, hating to appear weak but knowing he couldn't manage alone. He didn't touch the whiskey again. Something about Zara's quiet presence that night had shifted something in him, made him want to face his pain clear-eyed rather than blur it with alcohol. 2 weeks after Jamie's death, Kieran rode into town for supplies. He'd been avoiding it, not wanting to face the pitying looks and awkward condolences. But the ranch needed provisions, and he couldn't put it off any longer. As he loaded sacks of flour and coffee into his wagon outside the general store, he caught sight of Zara emerging from the schoolhouse across the street, a group of children trailing behind her. She wore a yellow dress today, bright as sunshine against the dusty street, and her smile as she spoke to one of the children made something twist in Kieran's chest. She glanced up and saw him watching. After a brief hesitation, she crossed the street toward him, her skirt swishing around her ankles. "Mr. Gray," she said formally, mindful of the curious eyes of townspeople around them. "It's good to see you in town, Miss Lawson," he replied with a nod, suddenly aware of his work-worn clothes and the stubble on his chin. "I meant to thank you properly for your kindness. I wasn't in a state to appreciate it fully at the time." "No thanks necessary," she assured him. "How are you faring?" The simple question, asked without pity, somehow made it possible for him to answer honestly. "Some days are harder than others. The mornings are the worst. I still expect to hear him moving around the cabin." Zara nodded in understanding. "The absence is sometimes louder than their presence ever was." "Exactly that," Kieran agreed, surprised by how precisely she had captured his feeling. A few curious glances were being directed their way, and Kieran was acutely aware of how unusual it was for the town's schoolteacher to be engaged in conversation with a rancher like himself. "Would you like to join me for supper at Mrs. Wilkins' boarding house?" Zara asked suddenly. "The food is quite good, and the company would be welcome. At least on my part." Kieran was taken aback by the invitation. "I'm hardly dressed for it. Mrs. Wilkins doesn't stand on ceremony," Zara said with a smile. "And I find I've grown tired of eating alone while the other boarders discuss the weather." There was something in her eyes, a loneliness that echoed his own, that made it impossible to refuse. "I'd be honored, Miss Lawson." "Zara, please," she said. "I think we've moved beyond formalities, don't you?" "Kieran, then," he agreed. That evening, scrubbed clean and wearing his one good shirt, Kieran entered Mrs. Wilkins' boarding house feeling distinctly out of place. The elderly proprietress gave him a curious look but welcomed him warmly enough when Zara explained he was her guest. They sat at a small table apart from the other boarders, mostly the bank clerk, the telegraph operator, and a couple of store clerks who cast occasional curious glances their way. The food was indeed good: roast chicken, potatoes, and fresh bread with butter. "How are your students?" Kieran asked, searching for a safe topic of conversation. Zara's face lit up. "They're wonderful. Eager to learn, most of them. Even little Tommy Miller, who would rather be anywhere but a classroom. The sheriff's boy? I can imagine he's a handful. He reminds me of someone," Zara said with a knowing look. "Someone who once told me he'd rather wrestle a ornery bull than sit still for book learning." Kieran chuckled, remembering his own words to her during one of their brief conversations in town months ago. "You have a good memory. It's a teacher's gift," she said with a smile. "Or curse, depending on how you look at it." As they ate, Kieran found himself increasingly aware of Zara as a woman, not just as the kind soul who had sat with him in his grief. She was beautiful in a quiet, unassuming way, her eyes expressive, her mouth quick to smile. She spoke with passion about her teaching and her students, her hands occasionally gesturing to emphasize a point. "Why Copper Creek?" he asked eventually. "A lady with your education could teach in a bigger town, with more comforts." Zara's expression grew more serious. "After my sister died, I needed a fresh start. Somewhere far from the memories. I saw the advertisement for a teacher here and decided that a small town in Arizona Territory was about as different from Boston as I could get." "Do you regret it?" Kieran asked, genuinely curious. She considered the question. "No. The work is rewarding, and there's a freedom here that I never had back east. Though I do miss certain conveniences. And bookshops. We're a bit short on those." Kieran agreed with a smile. They lingered over coffee until Mrs. Wilkins began giving them pointed looks. Reluctantly, Kieran rose to leave. "May I walk you back to your room?" he asked, not wanting the evening to end. "Just to the stairs," Zara replied, mindful of propriety. "Mrs. Wilkins has strict rules about gentlemen callers." They walked slowly to the foot of the stairs that led to the upstairs rooms. Kieran found himself searching for a reason to see her again. "There's a social at the church next Saturday," Zara said, as if reading his thoughts. "Perhaps you might attend?" "I'm not much for socializing," Kieran said honestly. Neither am I, if truth be told, Zara admitted. But sometimes it's good to remind ourselves we're still part of the world. Put that way, Kieran found he couldn't refuse. I'll be there. In the days leading up to the social, Kieran found himself thinking about Zara more often than not. She had seen him at his lowest point, drunk, grieving, barely coherent, and had offered kindness without judgment. It was a rare quality, and one he valued more than he could express. The social itself was a simple affair: tables of food brought by the townswomen, lemonade and coffee, and a few musicians playing fiddle and guitar for those who wanted to dance. Kieran arrived late, uncomfortable in his best clothes and with his hair still damp from washing. He spotted Zara immediately. She wore a blue dress he hadn't seen before, her hair arranged in an elegant twist that emphasized the graceful line of her neck. She was speaking with the minister's wife but looked up as if sensing his presence, her face brightening when she saw him. Kieran made his way to her side, nodding politely to the minister's wife, who excused herself with a knowing smile. "You came," Zara said, sounding pleased. "I said I would," Kieran replied simply. The evening passed more pleasantly than Kieran had expected. Several people expressed their condolences about Jamie, but in a way that felt genuine rather than obligatory. He found himself drawn into conversations about cattle prices, the need for rain, and the possibility of the railroad expanding to their area. Through it all, he remained aware of Zara moving through the room, speaking with parents of her students, laughing with other young women, occasionally glancing his way with a smile that felt like it was meant just for him. When the musician struck up a waltz, Kieran surprised himself by crossing the room to her side. "Would you care to dance, Miss Lawson?" he asked formally, mindful of the eyes watching them. Zara's eyes sparkled with amusement at his sudden formality. "I would be delighted, Mr. Gray." He led her onto the makeshift dance floor, acutely aware of how small her hand felt in his. It had been years since he'd danced, but the steps came back to him naturally. Zara followed his lead gracefully, her skirts swirling around them. "You dance well for a man who claims to avoid socials," she observed. "My mother insisted we learn," Kieran admitted. "Said even cowboys should know how to be gentlemen when the occasion called for it. She was a wise woman. She would have liked you," Kieran said, then immediately felt awkward for the implication. But Zara didn't seem to mind. "I think I would have liked her too." They danced until the music ended, then stood somewhat awkwardly on the edge of the floor. "Would you like to step outside for some air?" Kieran asked, suddenly needing to be away from the curious gazes. Zara nodded, and they slipped out onto the church porch. The night air was cool but pleasant, stars scattered across the sky like diamonds on black velvet. They stood side by side, looking out at the darkened street. "Thank you for encouraging me to come tonight," Kieran said after a comfortable silence. "You were right, it was good to remember I'm still part of the world. We all need reminding sometimes," Zara said softly. She turned to face him, her expression serious in the faint light from the church windows. "Kieran, I want you to know that I didn't seek you out that night out of pity." "Why did you then?" he asked, needing to know. She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "Because from the first time I saw you in town, something about you called to me. Your quiet strength, the way you cared for your brother, how you always treated everyone with respect, even old Mr. Jenkins when he was being particularly cantankerous." She smiled slightly at the memory. "When I heard about Jamie, I couldn't bear the thought of you facing that alone." Kieran was stunned by her candor. "I'm not a man of fancy words or education," he said slowly. "But I'm grateful every day that you came to my door that night. Not just for the comfort, but because it let me see who you truly are, brave and kind and strong in ways I never expected." Without overthinking, he reached out to take her hand. It was a small gesture but felt monumental in its significance. Zara's fingers curled around his, warm and reassuring. "I'd like to call on you properly," Kieran said. "If you'd permit it." "I'd like that very much," Zara replied, her voice soft but sure. Over the next few months, Their courtship progressed with a steady certainty that felt right to both of them. Kieran called at the boarding house every Sunday afternoon, taking Zara for walks or buggy rides. They attended church together, shared meals, and gradually became a recognized couple in the small community of Copper Creek. The grief of Jamie's loss didn't disappear, but it changed, becoming something Kieran could carry without being crushed by it. He spoke of his brother often with Zara, sharing memories both painful and joyful. In turn, she told him more about her sister, about Boston, about the life she'd left behind. One evening in early autumn, as they sat on the porch of the boarding house watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink, Kieran took Zara's hand in his. "I've been thinking," he said carefully. "The ranch is too big for just one person. The work never ends, and the house feels empty." He took a deep breath. "But with a wife, it might feel like home again." Zara turned to him, her eyes wide. "Kieran Gray, are you proposing to me?" He smiled, suddenly nervous. "I'm trying to." "I'm not doing it very well, am I?" "Ask me properly," she said, her voice trembling slightly with emotion. Kieran slid from the bench to one knee, still holding her hand in his. "Zara Lawson, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? I can't promise an easy life, but I can promise to love you every day for the rest of mine." Tears glistened in Zara's eyes as she nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will marry you." They were married on a clear October day, with the entire town in attendance. The schoolchildren presented their teacher with a handmade quilt as a wedding gift, each square sewn with care under the guidance of the minister's wife. Sheriff Miller gave the bride away, and Mrs. Wilkins wept openly throughout the ceremony. As they exchanged vows, Kieran thought of Jamie and how he would have stood proudly as best man, probably making everyone laugh with some ill-timed jest. The pain of his absence was still there, but alongside it now was a profound gratitude that out of such tragedy had come this unexpected joy. They moved into the ranch house together, Zara bringing warmth and life back into rooms that had grown cold with grief. She continued to teach, riding to town each morning and back each afternoon, refusing to give up the career she loved even as she embraced her new role as a rancher's wife. It was unconventional, but the town accepted it, recognizing that Zara's dedication to their children was a gift they couldn't afford to lose. Kieran expanded the ranch, hiring 2 hands to help with the cattle and building a new wing onto the house for the children they hoped would come. Each night they sat together by the fire, sometimes talking, sometimes reading, sometimes simply enjoying each other's presence. On the anniversary of Jamie's death, they rode together to his grave on the hillside overlooking the ranch. Kieran placed a bunch of wildflowers against the simple wooden cross while Zara stood quietly beside him. "I think you would be happy for us," Kieran said as they gazed out over the land that had been his brother's home. "He always said I needed someone to remind me there was more to life than work." "He was right," Zara said, slipping her hand into his. "Just as you remind me there's more to life than books and lessons." "We're good for each other," Kieran agreed, drawing her close to his side. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in the same blood-red hues as the day Jamie died, Kieran felt a sense of peace settle over him. The pain would never completely disappear, but it had changed, softened by time and by love. "Ready to go home?" Zara asked softly. Kieran looked down at his wife, her face glowing in the fading light, and felt a surge of gratitude for the woman who had sat with him until the bottle was empty and the sky was pale, who had helped him find his way back to life when he thought all was lost. "Yes," he said, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "Let's go home." They rode back to the ranch together as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, 2 people who had found in each other not just love, but healing and hope and the promise of a future neither had expected to find in the wild, untamed beauty of the West.